we're looking at another part of Latin America, Cuba. The Center for Global Justice regularly runs trips to Cuba, educational trips. I took one in June that focused on the new cooperatives in Cuba. And in November, Jennifer is going to be leading a trip focused on organic agriculture and cooperatives, but more the agricultural cooperatives. We have information here about those trips, which I'll hand out to you later in case you're interested in participating. That trip will be Thanksgiving week, November 20 to 29. But we're not going to be talking so much about the trip as it is about organic agriculture, something that Cuba has become world famous for, really the first country to convert from industrial agriculture to organic agriculture. Something that many more countries are likely to have to do in future years. And in addition, as part of its renovation of socialism, Cuba is now expanding the cooperative sector into urban areas, and I'll be talking about that. But first, let me give the floor to Jennifer to cover the agricultural aspect.
Sure. Hi. As Cliff reminded me this morning, I speak very quickly, so if I start going too fast, you can tell me to slow down. And since we are a small group, please especially feel free to interject with the question as I present. But a little bit about myself. I was born in Pennsylvania and on a small farm, and swore I'd have nothing to do with it when I was older. But I just hadn't found my niche, is what I discovered. And I ended up coming back to the fold. I'm very passionate about small-scale organic gardening and seed saving. And my story with Cuba is a little bit interspersed with coming back to the fold in the organic agriculture front. But in the year 2000, I began a job with Witness for Peace, which is an organization that takes U.S. citizens to Cuba and other Latin American countries to learn about how U.S. policies affect them. And that time, Clinton administration had been opening up travel, and it was pretty easy to have a group. When I finished that position, I started working with Oxfam America, coordinating their Cuban projects. That's under the Clinton administration, they've been opening for some money to be released with the authorization of the Treasury Department, especially in the cooperative sector. And groups are looking for ways to wedge that open further. But as I took that job, the Bush administration began, and I became very unsuccessful at getting any of those funds released into Cuba. And I just saw as connections began to dry up between U.S. and Cuba again. And so that work was coming to an end, and I said, well, the Bush administration is saying I can't go to Cuba, so I'm going to go. And I went back and I did a master's program in agroecology and sustainable agriculture, which is how I started coming back to the fold on agriculture. Shortly afterwards, I came back and worked in California for an organization that promotes biointensive agriculture. And that's when I started dating my Cuban husband. Not when we were living in the same place. But that's what brought me back to the island for another 1.5 years when I married my husband in 2008. And then we eventually arrived here in San Miguel when we just had trouble making it work in Cuba. Not many people from the U.S. looking for jobs there. We've been in San Miguel for 6 years, and we go back to the island regularly, including the trips that Cliff mentioned. So that's who I am. I've lived in Cuba for over 5 years in different time periods, but now go back for snapshots of what Cuba looks like. And it's changing really quickly, so it's hard to keep up. And as I mentioned, I'm from Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania and Cuba have one thing in common. they had about basically the same geographical mass and about the same population, around 13 million. One thing they don't have in common is that people tend to go to Cuba and think they become experts. It's like going to Pennsylvania and thinking you're an expert, because Pennsylvania is pretty distinct, and Cuba, there's a lot to learn as well. So I'll just be sharing a little bit about what I know on the organic agriculture front. And I broke my little talk into different myths, because there's lots of myths running around. The first one being that all Cuban agriculture is organic. And while we would like to think that's true, most of the organic production came into being, as Cliff alluded to, because of economic necessity. When the Soviet Union broke apart, 85% of the imports were lost. The whole Cuban colony collapsed. No fertilizers, no chemical inputs were available for farming, and so farmers began using biological organic practices. It's similar to Haiti. The reasons Haiti has a lot of ecological agriculture because of necessity. There's no funds to move for chemical fertilizers. Not everyone in the Ministry of Agriculture in Cuba has been convinced, even though there's a lot of big spotlight that all Cuban produce is organic. Several sectors hardly have had any inroads into organic agriculture, principally tobacco, sugarcane, potatoes. Potatoes don't grow easily in Cuba, but Cubans, because of the Spanish heritage, love potatoes. It's one of the heaviest uses of chemicals on the island, with the mandated 18 chemical applications, and now documentation that it has caused significant cancer increases in communities that are potato growing. And so at least they're getting a spotlight on that. The one sector that has been really successful in becoming chemical free is the production of green leafy vegetables. What you'll hear about Cuban urban farming. So with the crisis in the fall of the Soviet Union, I mean, most of Cuban ag had been happening on the outskirts, out in the rural areas. Well, now you had challenges of even getting that food into the cities. And so then Minister of Defense Raul Castro became one of the leading figures in promoting what they became known as organoponics, which signify the urban gardens. And if you know anything about hydroponics, that's kind of where organiponics came out of. At the time of the collapse, Cuba was experimenting with doing these very technified hydroponic kind of growing. And they end up creating this word around organoponics out of that when that all collapsed. Organoponics, or the urban gardens, typically have raised beds that use compost and worm compost, use biofertilizers, avoid chemical, but by regulation, they are not to apply any chemicals. Like many human endeavors, you have intentions, and then sometimes they're not carried out. It's not a certified crop, so there are sometimes irregularities in that. But for the great majority of those productions, those leafy vegetables, that is without chemicals. So that's myth number one. Not all production in Cuba is organic. Myth number two is that everyone has a backyard garden. Because we hear about the organic revolution in Cuba, we associate that with backyard gardens. And while that was a little more true in the 90s, people started growing a little bit in their backyard, it's not a common practice throughout the island. Most of the organic gardening happens in these larger plots. When they started converting these urban plots into organic production, I mean, they're large parcels, like taking over abandoned lots within urban and peri-urban spaces. Let's see what I have for myth number three. Myth number three. A lot of times on my tours and when we go, and because we've heard about organic agriculture in Cuba, we think that Cubans eat lots of vegetables. And they don't. It's not part of their diet. One of my partners, a director, Raul Suarez. He's the director of the Martin Luther King Center, who we partner with for the trip. He's a backyard. He is actually a backyard gardener. He's very passionate. He has his own backyard garden. He grew up in the rural countryside and moved to the city, but still misses it a lot. But he put it this way. He's like, when I was young, I remember when we ate vegetables once a year. Avocado and a slice of tomato at Christmas time. And so it's like now, people eat lots more. They look for tomatoes, they look for some small portion of leafy vegetables, but it's not the main plate. And Cuban cuisine tends to be very heavy. You must have some beans, some sort of tuber,
rice,
and rice. I mean, Cubans will serve pasta with rice, and and that little part of salad. One of the challenges for more salad consumption is that it is expensive in comparison to those other elements. It hasn't been as heavily subsidized. It's been a sector that's also grown up with a lot more of the private initiatives. And now with tourist industry driving, tourists want veggies, right? So they're eating oftentimes those veggies are being first gobbled up by the tourist sector currently, and that's one of the new challenges Cuba's facing as the tourist sector is booming with U.S. relations warming up again. So another myth I had is that Cuba produces all of its food. Like most places, well, it is an island, it's not an island. We live in a globalized world. And so Cuba currently imports about 2/3 of all of its production, which is not off in comparison to its Caribbean neighbors. Sometimes people take that statistic out of context and say, well, it's because the Cuban system doesn't work at all. There's lots of things that don't work about the Cuban system, like any human endeavor. But the importation challenge is a common challenge for island countries. Currently, Cuba is importing about $2 billion worth of foodstuffs, mostly rice, meats, and grains. And many experts do predict that could be produced in Cuba. About only 70% of the arable land is currently in use. And although 65% of the arable land is either moderately or severely degraded. That's according to Cubans' own statistics. And that in grand part is because of that heavy conventional chemical farming happened previous to the 90s. So they're still dealing with those consequences. Not only the chemical applications, but also the use of heavy machinery that's not apt for tropical soils. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba was proud to say they had the most tractors per capita in the world. You learn things as you go on. Maybe it wasn't the best idea. One of the things that the crisis did bring on was the return to more animal traction, the use of oxen, which is more environmentally friendly. Lots of anecdotes about the conversion of the process of the challenges in that time, being that tractor drivers who no longer had jobs driving tractors because there wasn't gasoline became oxen drivers. They tried to treat the animals like machinery. That didn't go so well. But a lot of lessons, Cuba has shared a lot of lessons of the use of animal traction with Latin America as it's fallen out of disservice. So that's been an interesting takeaway from this experience. Another myth is that there are no GMOs in Cuba. The truth is trickier. Government officials do try to make it sound as if there hasn't been any at times, depending on who you're talking to, even in official publications. When I was doing my agroecology master's program, I was invited to the Biotech Institute for a debate on GMOs. It was a little bit of like whitewashing, like, okay, we believe in this, but we're going to invite some academics who don't believe in this to share their reasons why. It is true, though, that while there's allegations, even from my professors at the university, that Monsanto at that time was already present at the biotech industry in Cuba is a state-controlled industry, and some people will point that behooves the safeguards in the system, that it's not a capital venture. I don't have that much faith in any human endeavors involving GMOs, but that is true. And the grand part of the biotech industry in Cuba is more related to pharmaceuticals and not to plant production at the time. But they have been working on a BT corn variety that is produced in Cuba, and at very least done experimental plots throughout the island. And one of the largest challenges in Cuba around this issue is that the lack of knowledge. Cuban population in general don't have information to make decisions about what GMOs. There's certainly no labeling process. They, like Mexico, they import tons of GMO crops. They might not be producing them. They're importing soy from Brazil, which is 80% GMO. Depending on the time, they are importing corn and soybeans also from the United States. So they do have a lot of GMOs that are coming into the country. I wanted to say something else. Recently you may have seen that Tom Vilsack, the U.S. What is he called? The US Secretary of Agriculture. I wanted to call him the Agricultural Minister, but that's not what we say in the U.S. So he just visited Cuba a couple months ago, and then there was a return visit of the Ag Minister to Iowa, and they did visit DuPont Pioneer, which is one of the #1 chemical and GMO centers in the States. So those are kind of updates around GMOs. Oh wait, I'm going to skip this one because, where'd it go? Oh, because that links to this myth that, or what I consider a myth, is that the U.S. threatens the Cuban organic agriculture movement. It's been like that for a long time. Cuba, while they haven't been able to import quantities of conventional ag from the U.S. Since 2000, there has been openings for Cuba to receive agricultural imports from the States. That's mostly challenged because of restrictions around financing those different purchases, but it has been possible. I personally don't think it's challenged. Isn't capable of being overcome on the Cuban side. I think the sustainable ag in Cuba can hold its own against these large conglomerates, but it's to be seen. Obama brought a bunch of ag lobbyists on his recent trip, including ADM. There's lobbyists that are just fighting at the bit to get more of that market. Other myths I wanted to just go over was, this one's actually kind of true, but there's this perception that no one can own land in Cuba. There are different land categories. There are small farmers who do own their land and hold on to the land, pass it on to their family members, can trade it out. There's also a new land reform where you can acquire land, and there's this back to the land movement with people gobbling up new tracts if they see an opportunity to grow agricultural produce. At the same time, like many countries, most of Cuban farmers are 65 plus, and so Cuba did a great job educating lots of people. But unfortunately, a lot of that education went to everyone needs to be professional, and not the same emphasis in going into how valuable farmer and food production is. So this younger generation doesn't see it as so attractive to stay on the land. But these new land reforms and with openings in the market, it is becoming more attractive for younger people to ask for land that is held in usufruct indefinitely, and the land reforms are looking at new ways to make it really attractive, because the original reforms did not include the possibility to build your own home on the land. It's hard to get attached to growing food if you're not living there at the same place. And it looks like it will move forward in that direction. I saw a recent article that said, oh, agriculture doesn't pay really well. They said, oh, they only make $25 a month. That $25 a month is with working in the state sector. It's not actually a bad paid job in Cuba, that's how the system may work. And certainly in Cuba today, farmers are actually seen as millionaires in terms of in pesos. So they can make a lot of money in comparison to the rest of the population. And I would say that it's actually the opposite. They have to deal with the public thinking they have higher prices, and the state looks to control that a bit and having caps. And so it's a balance between the demand and the current offering. But agriculture at the small scale is certainly, there's lots of opportunity. And as the Ag Secretary pointed out, there will be opportunities for organic production to be shipped to the U.S. In the future. I don't think that's going to be very easy to begin with. I'm pretty strongly opinionated that Cuba needs to focus on their own production first. But it is a possibility to have organic production in sectors like fruit, tropical fruits and whatnot, sugarcane, coffee, and so on. But currently, as I mentioned before, most of the production isn't organically certified. It's like similar to our farmers market here, that it's raised according to organic standards, but it's not with all the certifications. So the last one, the myth I would like to close with is more general, which is that the embargo is over and that the travel restrictions are over. There's still a great deal to work on, but certainly there's an openings here. There's lots of going on in terms of organic agriculture. There's lots of organic farmers in the U.S. that are traveling to Cuba. There's been Cuban farmers that have recently traveled to organic events in the States. So it is facilitating the flow of information, and that behooves a growing organic movement in Cuba. One challenge in the future will be to have a cross-sectoral organic movement. It's tended to be only farmer-related. The demand from consumers is different. They haven't created a movement across the whole public. So lots of exciting things happening in Cuba. I think lots of lessons to learn from that experience.
Okay. Well, let's have questions for Jennifer before we go on to co-ops. Any questions or comments? Yeah, Chris.
Cliff and I have discussed this. When I went, I don't know, how many years ago, 2-3 years ago on the first organic farming global justice tour, there was talk of how trucks with produce were showing up on the outskirts of town, and that's where seemed like that's where the marketing was going on. And then Cliff had mentioned that they got after the truckers or something. But how is the marketing of such, veggies and stuff going on?
Right. Most farmers sell within some sort of cooperative. So there's a credit and services cooperative. There are agricultural production cooperatives. There are the larger state unit, for lack of a better translation. And they typically organize different posts. With the new openings, with the reforms, it's possible for you to get a permission to sell your produce. So you have one permission to be a farmer. You apply, get those, that all in order. And it's another permit to go and actually sell your produce. And one of the new openings is that you can sell it directly to the consumer. You can sell directly to hotels. You can sell directly to restaurants. And so this is all new ground that entrepreneurs are taking on. You mentioned like the whole trucks, like as I said about before, like, this offer and demand, and people selling want to get the highest price, and the public wants to get the lowest price, and the state tries to also like intervene at points. And so it's all still being figured out. There are different urban markets that you can sell produce at. As I mentioned before, it is most produce is typically pretty expensive for the average Cuban budget. I walked by, last time I went through an urban market, I walked by a bag of peeled garlic. Garlic's kind of challenging to grow in Cuba, so it can be in demand. Because it needs cold, so Cuba doesn't get a lot of cold. You can grow it, but it's hard to grow without cold. But garlic is also one of the key components in Cuban. That whole, they know we should know. So it was a bag of peeled garlic. It was selling for 100 pesos at the private market. 100 pesos is about what my mother-in-law gets for her monthly pension. So right now, some of the things we're seeing with the new changes in Cuba really are this opening gap between people who have worked in the state sector versus the private initiatives versus Cubans that have access to remittances from the state. The peso-dollar relationship is becoming even more skewed as an example. So got a little off track on answering your question on how people sell their produce. But
Can you tell us something about the level of productivity of organic agriculture?
Oh, yes, I missed a quote. Well, first a general quote. The different sectors have different percentages of efficiency, I would say. Cuba has definitely observed that the most productive are the small farmers. They 25% who are considered small farmers actually produce 65% of the agricultural produce. And so that was one of the reasons that has now driven these new land reforms and the state breaking up the state enterprises, which the state enterprises are the ones that typically have been the heaviest chemical users. And so that's exciting to see for that. Cuba's done a great deal of investigation and research and looking at productivity on organics, and that's seeing that it's competitive in the production, and just their general experience showing the world that it is possible to have a more organic focused agriculture and have high levels of efficiency. And as I pointed out, looking over the long haul, looking at the hidden consequences and costs of the chemical ag versus the organic ag, as I spoke about with soil degradation. When you take those costs into consideration, the efficiency is really way ahead on the organic agriculture.
And that's efficiency measured in product per hectare of land, not per labor time.
In terms of labor time, similar to around the world, organic agriculture tends to be use more human resources. But that has to do in part too with like the limited, like using less mechanical. And one of the challenges in Cuba, it's a tropical place. Biomass grows quickly, so weeds grow quickly. One of the challenges is in weed control. Marambu is a thorny bush that takes over agricultural, like grazing land. Often what will happen, there will be an application, a chemical application to get rid of the marabu, or try to get rid of the marabu with the human part, and then after that will be used under organic management. But in terms of efficiency, the numbers, people like to throw out numbers. It's hard to say. Like you'll see numbers when you do research about so many pounds or so many kilos produced per hectare. But if you don't know if it's a leafy green versus garlic versus potatoes, it's hard to say. I don't really like those numbers. But certainly with the human element, you can say there's more humans possibly needed for organic agriculture. But you have people that can work. You just need to often challenges getting people to want to work in that sector, which again is worldwide.
I understand there was a UN report a few years ago claiming that organic agriculture could feed the world, that we don't need industrial agriculture, you know, for...
Not, I mean chemical versus chemical agriculture, because
Yeah,
certainly some of those organic agriculture does allow for industrial, mechanized,
Right.
whatnot. Yes, and it certainly, the documentation certainly looks worldwide that study did not come out just from the Cuban experience. It came out on the worldwide experience around organics. It's very difficult to get real information on conventional ag production because it doesn't behoove the companies that promote it. So they try to, and they fund a lot of the land universities. So research going often shows how productive conventional agriculture is, but there's been a small segment of academics looking at productivity of organics versus conventional, and it does point out that is the way.
Jenny, I would like to ask, what do you think could happen, because this is some of the worries that in this moment in the sector is happening in Cuba, because the advance of alternative agriculture, I will say, has been very interesting, no? What they are doing, not only with the production of food, also with the management of the, for example, the forest, the fruit trees, and other sectors. What would be the impact on the agricultural sector in Cuba if the relation with the United States increase, especially with big transnational companies? Because I read that, for example, John Deere, the company of tractors, they're gonna build a plant in Cuba. They're gonna construct John Deere tractors in some province in Cuba. I don't remember which one.
Maranhão Port.
In Marianao Port. So my worry is all this advance that Cuba has after the collapse of the Soviet Union has been very interesting for this new way of thinking to produce food. So what do you see in the future if continue increasing this relation with the...
I mean, it'll be a challenge. I get frustrated, I sometimes am frustrated when it's like, oh, we can't open up because they can't do it on their own. Well, that's pretty paternalistic view of looking at Cubans. Cubans are, know how to organize. They'll have the challenge of organizing, create stronger policies about what kind of agriculture they want. And as I alluded to before, not everyone in the high-ranking agriculture ministry ever became convinced that organic agriculture was the way. Many of them have always wanted more chemicals. And so as that generation retires, passes away, there'll be this upcoming generation that will need to inform and create those policies. One of a quote that I saw in an article as I was getting ready for the talk from Miguel Aldieri, who is a world-famous agroecologist, a professor at Berkeley. He mentioned one of the challenges was that many of the folks that have led the ag movement in Cuba have been related to small farmers. And the small farming sector has always been pretty powerful. There's a whole mass organization that groups them together. They historically had very strong ties to Raul Castro, who's now in power. And they could just, the leaders could just be like, hey, Raul, what's up? And now is that they, died. Raul doesn't have that same relationship with the younger generation. And so that is a challenge for the formation of the new policy and the executive branch. So to answer your question, I'm hopeful that Cuban policies can successfully put put a balance to like necessity, and there's certainly always a necessity for mechanized equipment, but how do you use that mechanized equipment? And interestingly enough, I've also, and when I was reviewing from the presentation, there's all sorts of articles right now where it says Florida farmers are scared of Cuban produce invading Florida. So I think it's the key is strengthening the links between organic sectors around the world.
I had a question about when you did your master's work, was that a university or a program based in Cuba? And is that, I mean, I was just wondering about you're saying most of the farmers are over 60. But if they, so is that part of an effort to, the other question related to that was just, you said something like the farmers are well off relative to the rest of the population. You think that would be some kind of incentive also? But
right, farmers are well, which is what is driving the current, is in part driving the current return, or looking for younger people to go. But in some ways, it's some of that return is just driven for financial reasons. Like, I mean, get as much money out of this investment as quickly as possible. Not organic farmers in the States and even other Latin American countries. There's usually financial interest. There's also some sort of environmental, like kind of like those.
But this university, this degree where you studied, did they push the environmental aspects and the?
Like more deep environmentalist approach. It's still more technical. It was a program that grew out, actually, interesting enough, in relationship with universities in the United States. But it tended to be, there's not any farmers in my program. There's all people that were going to be related to the technical field.
I asked that question. We went out to the Ag University, I guess, where you went.
Yes, that's where I did my master's program.
And I said, well, how many of your graduates actually become farmers? And they said, hardly any. And I have an ag degree from New Mexico. And I tried to think back, I mean, how many people were going to go be extension agents? You know, those are the people that drive around and talk to farmers in the U.S. And there was a fair number of ranchers, but now they send me letters trying to get people to go to ag school. No one's going to ag school in the U.S. in the West anymore. So,
right. Most of the education around organic agriculture, on ecological agriculture, which has been actually wildly successful, has been through the Small Farmers Association and through a program called Farmer to Farmer Training. And so the Small Farmers Association, in conjunction with international funding, different development programs, have done a lot of education that way about how to make biofertilizers, how to make better compost, how to all these things. But that's been a direct farmer to farmer. Typically, when farmers go to university, or farmers, next generation out of the farmer families go to university, they're lost to farming. They become technicians or they become other professionals. But a lot of wildly successful farmer-to-farmer trainings have happened in Cuba. And that's how a bunch of this knowledge was multiplied in the 90s when, overnight, the conventional farming dried up, these options. But it's also true that for many of these small farmers, they weren't necessarily producing with chemicals in the first place.
Right.
They did have access during the fat cow years in Cuba. They could get it more easily from the state. But the bigger culprits of the use in chemicals were always the state farms, the large state farms. So the small farmers were the natural it was easier to take over organic practices because they weren't as far removed as the state endeavors to welcome chemicals with heralding the future.
One other question. What about livestock? Is that
and organic management?
Organic and just in general?
There's lots of livestock on small farmers' holdings, although depends on what sector. typically egg production, for example, has been in larger state entities in the last 50 years. What other? But most of the other ones have some form into like cooperatives. Small producers produce milk. That milk is sold in the cooperative. That milk is often sold from the cooperative to a state entity.
Is it typically organic or partial?
Partial by default, by not having antibiotics or whatnot. I think my opinion would be there's also been a lot of information on how to manage things organically. Trying to think of other examples, but the larger state sectors, mostly more chemical, influence. So.
See, I would like to say something about it. The School of Agriculture in Havana. They have two institutes very important for the Cuban economy in the agricultural sector. One is el Centro de Investigaciones en las plantas. ¿Te acuerdas cómo se llamaba?
Aquí está el edito.
Sí. Anyway, one institute is for plants and the other institute is for animals. So Cuba has developed a lot of medicines and vaccines, their own production to keep very healthy the livestock, no? Porks, cows, no, and goats, and because they have they had many problems during the revolution because the disease that entered for some kind of sabotage to the livestock in Cuba. One case was the fever of the porks, and they killed thousands of porks. That was at the beginning of the revolution. So things like that happen. So Cuba starts to take care a lot how they manage the animals. So in some way, I don't know how is the production of the food they give to the animals, but what I know is that they have a very well-known center of health, animal health in a lot of sectors of production.
I know that Southwest Florida, there are some farmers that have a connection with Cuba now that are exporting beef cattle to Cuba to be raised in Cuba. So that's been going on probably for 10 years.
Right, about the openings for those kinds of transactions from north to south have been open for a while, and certainly one of the challenges of having an closed system of getting better genetics. It's a challenge within Cuba, so it's great to hear that kind of opening. But I also don't know, and internally, there's not a demand. Cubans always want more meat. Meat production has been really low, and I've never heard a demand like, okay, I'm only going to buy organic, or they just. So the demands are different there as well. When you're looking at limited production and access, it's not the first thing on the average consumer's demand list. Can I have an egg or not?
Earlier you referred to the growing exchange between organic producers in the U.S. and Cuba. Now, you've worked for Via Organica. Its parent organization is Organic Consumers Association. Is OCA interested in cultivating those exchanges?
Well, right now, there's a relationship between Via Organica and Greenpeace here in Mexico, and they're investigating the possibility of taking the Greenpeace boat to Cuba in February and having a small, one of the things that Organic Consumers Association has been working on lately has been the demand for, instead of demanding organic agriculture, has been for consumers to demand regenerative agriculture, have a more holistic approach to food. And looking at issues then like around animal management and whatnot. And so they would like to have a summit in Cuba in February 2017. That answers. I mean, that's one example that could open up. Organic Consumer Association, like its name implies, does work mostly with consumers and not necessarily the producers and farmers. Although there's natural ties, obviously, to those sectors.
How about trade?
In terms of promoting trade?
No, trade of organic products. I know the U.S. has relaxed restrictions. What are the Cuban regulations concerning imports and exports of from the U.S.?
Of organic products?
Of organics, specifically?
Well, since early 2000, there's been a possibility for Cuban to import agricultural products from the States, organic or conventional. And as I said before, the financial handicaps, not having the same terms of trade available, has been the biggest hang-up. When that policy was opened up from the U.S., Cuba actually bought a lot from the U.S., more as just like a political leverage to get more U.S. farmers to lobby for change. And over time, because of the difficulties in the trade negotiations, that fell down. And now with Obama visiting, it's opening up. But it'll be opening up for both the conventional sector and the organic sector. But mostly that demand for organics is where I would imagine it's going to be a very small elite, mostly for the tourist community.
I think that's the reason. Yeah.
And the biggest, most interesting challenges is these questions around sovereignty and food sovereignty.
Yes.
If you have a country that is importing 2/3 of the production, a lot of lessons that Cuba learned kind of, at the beginning of the 90s, like, we need to be more food sovereign, just out of necessity, we can't rely on anyone, we need to have a partner, kind of got lost in the shuffle of what was happening on the international stage again. We just need to buy from where you figure it out. But then needs to be constantly examined, confronting climate change. Cuba's not going to have it easy. The worsening hurricanes,
higher temperatures.
Food production will only become more challenging. Prices to import will only rise. So there's lots of research to be done on the best varieties in Cuba, and the relationships between tropical countries. So the U.S. isn't the only place they'll be learning from. And Vilsack, about the ag. I have here some.
And I think it's also cultural because, for example, there are many products in Cuba that they don't consume and they have it. For example, there is a fruit, it's called here in Mexico carambolo, that is delicious. In Cuba, they don't eat it. And they have the trees, and this fruit is pudriéndose en el piso, ¿cómo se dice pudriéndose?
Rotting on the ground.
Rotting on the ground. And it's an excellent fruit, and it's very expensive here in Mexico. So it's cultural. There are, for example, verdolagas. Las verdolagas no se las comen.
Purslane, yeah, haven't. Maybe they just don't know. They don't eat, nopales here. But I told Raul Suarez, who I said is a passionate yard gardener, in addition to being the director of the King Center and a member of the National Assembly. But he has a health condition, and they wanted him to be taking omega-3, which is hard to find in Cuba. And I told his daughter, I know, I've seen purslane in his garden. You should go eat that. And they were just.
Yeah.
She got mad at me. She got angry at me for suggesting her father eat a weed. So I don't know.
But Cuba does export tobacco and sugar and things like that, right?
Yes, there is export.
So,
that's what I wanted to say. That reminds me of what I wanted to say. The first Cuban export in 50 years to the United States will be coffee for Nescafe, for Nestle. So that is not really what I would want it to be, right? So low-end coffee, which doesn't necessarily, look at organic practices, perhaps, to a company that's not been known for its environmental practices around the world. But that's what won out. And as they opened up the possibility for Cuban exports to the States again, this is huge. This is the first time in 50 years, is going to be coffee for Nespresso.
Right.
So, I mean, I have heard of, different organic groups that promote organics in the States to, to work to have organics come to the States. Dr. Bronner's is interested in possibly in different products from the island. Again, the challenge is really going to be on getting everything up to standard, figuring out the logistics of moving produce back and forth. But there will be opportunities, I believe. But then there's a question. If farmers are like, oh, the most lucrative thing is to produce organic X for the States and start producing that, what about all the 12 million, 13 million Cubans that also just need to eat and want more fresh produce? So, interesting ethical questions.
Okay, one last comment before we...
I was going to say that because of the collectivization of the farms, a lot of the farmland, particularly sugar, a lot of people moved from the rural areas to Havana and Santiago and big cities. And the skills and the desire to farm have been lost, haven't they, on a fair amount of people. And it will take a lot of incentive, like these programs, to give people land to use at least for 10 years or something.
Right, there's lots of incentives for academic programs to become professionals in other fields.
Yeah.
Now there needs to be the same incentives for farmers. Another area that was kind of lost in this, and a lot of the work was done to create opportunities for the rural sector.
Yeah.
In the trades, in carpentry, masonry, whatnot, that was again seen as like second tier. Certainly, and so it's been lost. So it's kind of same need in the agricultural sector to say, farmers are cool. That's what's happening in the state. The fastest growing sector in the States in agriculture is organics. I took my father, who's this gray-haired 65-year-old, to a sustainable ag conference in Pennsylvania. He's like, oh my God, everyone's young here. Everyone used to go into these conventions and everyone's old. There's no young people coming in. So there's a possibility of having the same thing happen in Cuba.
Okay, well, let's move on to the second aspect of Cuba that we wanted to look at today, cooperatives. Cooperatives are getting a lot of attention now because under the renovation reforms that are going on, there's been a big expansion of cooperatives into the urban sector of the economy. But cooperatives are not new to Cuba. In the agricultural area, there have been cooperatives from the early days of the revolution. Small farmers and the like. And then in the 90s, most of the land was structured as state farms. But in the 90s, those state farms were broken up into what are called basic units of cooperative production, UBPCs, which were cooperatives where workers on the state farm were given the use of pieces of land to work as cooperatives. As a result, now something like 82% of the land in Cuba is cultivated by cooperatives. The UBPCs were not really that successful as cooperatives for a number of reasons. But cooperatives were limited to the agricultural sector of the economy until just a few years ago. In 2012, at its December meeting, the National Assembly passed a law on urban cooperatives, or non-agricultural cooperatives, setting up a legal framework for the formation of cooperatives on an experimental basis in urban services, most of them are in the food area, construction, transportation, and other areas of activity. And there was an initial approval for the formation of 498 urban cooperatives. Not all of them are up and running, even now, almost 4 years later. I hear different numbers as to how many are actually in operation. 350 is a number that is often put out. But there is a caution in the establishment of urban cooperatives. As I said, these were started on an experimental basis in order to see the problems that might arise and to work out the most effective way of establishing urban co-ops. The aim was that by this year, 2016, it would be possible to adopt a comprehensive cooperative law that would be based upon what has been learned from these initial experimental ones. Well, it doesn't look like 2016 is going to see such a law yet. There, as part of, there's an ongoing discussion now in Cuba around the conceptualization of how Cuba conceives of its socialism. And that discussion is supposed to culminate in a report to the National Assembly this December. And so maybe that will break the logjam and open the way for further expansion of urban cooperatives. There are many groups that want to form cooperatives, and some that are functioning as cooperatives even though they don't have that legal status, that they're not a legal entity that can function as a cooperative, but kind of de facto cooperatives. Cooperatives waiting for papers, they're sometimes called. The basic idea of the cooperatives, urban cooperatives, is that they must have at least 3 members, but can have many, many more. This June, I visited one cooperative that has 120 members. This is a restaurant, interestingly. You wouldn't think that there could be work for 120 people in a restaurant, but I suspect that most of them do not work full-time. For example, I talked to the bartender there, and he'd formerly been a state worker, and he said, in one day here, I can earn as much as I used to earn in my state job.
In 1 month.
Yeah, so you wouldn't have to work many days in the month in order to be able to live quite well. Generally, the co-ops have been quite successful in that, just measured by income. On the average, a study was done by the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy at the University of Havana. A study was done of 40 co-ops in the Havana area, and that's where most of them are located so far. And it was reported that on the average, co-op members increased their income 3-fold in some cases had income 7 times of what they had had before as state workers. Most of the cooperatives that have been formed from what were previously state enterprises. There are also some self-organized cooperatives where people came together to form a co-op, but most of them, I think 70-some%, were formed from state enterprises. Many of them state restaurants, where the state simply said, well, you're no longer going to be state employees. If you want to continue working here, you can join the cooperative. Frequently that happened without much preparation in the principles of a cooperative, not much education or training of people on what a cooperative was and how it functions. That has been a problem. Usually the director of the former state enterprise has been given some training by the municipal government perhaps, but not much in the way of preparation of the members of the co-op or other members of the co-op. There are groups like the Institute of Philosophy and others as well, but our contact has been mainly through the Institute of Philosophy. They have been doing workshops in central Havana, especially, to try to train co-op members. Because a co-op is supposed to be a democratically self-managed enterprise where the members of the co-op participate in decision-making, frequently in the form of a monthly General Assembly, where basic policy decisions are made and direction given to the group that has been selected to do the day-to-day management of the co-op. Yeah.
What is the nature of a co-op there? To my mind, a co-op would be, you gave an example of a restaurant, would be many restaurants would form that co-op. But you gave the example of the employees of a restaurant form a co-op. Mm-hmm. And so I'm confused about which or if both definitions might apply.
Well, in the United States, we have examples of producer co-ops, as they're called. Mm-hmm. That is a number of different producers, which are maybe not cooperatives at all, but come together to form a cooperative for marketing purposes or...
Such as southern states or some of the right. Beef cattle industries.
Exactly.
Things like
that.
Yes.
I grew up in North Dakota, across the street from a creamery. There was a cooperative.
Milk ties.
That is, you had different dairy farmers sure. who belonged to that cooperative.
Yes.
So it was a producer cooperative, mm-hmm. cooperation among producers. Mm-hmm. What we're talking about in Cuba is worker cooperatives, okay. where the people who work in an enterprise form the cooperative.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, the restaurant that I referred to earlier, El Biky is the name of it.
Biky?
B-I-K-Y. Biky. Is a worker-originated cooperative. It's not a conversion from a state restaurant. It's less than a year old. It is in a facility that used to be a state enterprise. It was a pizza place. And then it became one of the few vegetarian restaurants in Cuba. But that didn't go well. Cubans aren't vegetarians, by and large. And for, I think, like 5 years, the building was vacant and unused. The ministry said, well, let's give it to a co-op. And so there was a group that formed a cooperative, a small group initially. They got a loan from the bank, Metropolitan Bank, to renovate the building. And as the work was going on, there were people who came by and said, any chance of getting a job here? And they said, well, if you want to join the co-op. And so they came into a co-op understanding what a co-op was and having a sense of ownership about it. Those are the ideal conditions for the formation of cooperative, not the conversions from the state enterprises. You know, we visited a textile factory next to Guayabera's shirts for men and for women. It was formerly a state textile factory that was converted into a co-op, and you could see the difference. The director, the manager, referred to my workers. She had very much the notion that, you know, she was in charge and they are my workers. They had monthly general assemblies, but I would be very doubtful that they were very democratic in their actual operations. That's one of the places that the Institute of Philosophy is doing workshops to train people into what their rights are and what their responsibilities are as members of co-op. You know, so this will be a process to develop a real, functioning, healthy cooperative. Basically, what the conversion into a co-op meant initially for this textile factory was that whereas before the director had to get decisions from the ministry above, couldn't take initiatives, now that link has been cut, and now she's in charge. And without her becoming accountable to the workers in the co-op, you don't have a healthy situation. You need to develop a cooperative culture. And as I say, that's a process that will take time, that takes training. You know, really, this situation in Cuba, where state enterprises are being converted into cooperatives, is unique in the world. Throughout the world, most cooperatives have been formed by people coming together to make a cooperative. You don't find very many examples where governments have let loose of enterprises that they, you know, controlled and turned it over to workers. But that's what's happening in Cuba. So it's a very, very interesting experiment, and one that I think will be of, you know, great historical importance globally. Cuba is poised where it can become really the first country in the world to have cooperatives make up a major sector of its economy. Basically, what the state is doing is giving up control of those portions of the economy that it could not run well. Back in 1968, in what was called the Revolutionary Offensive, all small businesses were taken over by the revolution. And the state then undertook to try to run restaurants, and barber shops, and all kinds of small enterprises. And in some cases ran them well, but in many cases did not run them well. And the state has finally decided that the state cannot do everything.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of socialism that came to us out of the Russian experience in the 20th century was that socialism meant the state runs the economy. The state owns the means of production and runs them, manages them. Well, what we're seeing now in Cuba and elsewhere in Latin America as well is an understanding that there's a different approach to building socialism. The state doesn't have to do everything. This, as in the case of Cuba, the state still owns the means of production. It owns the land. It owns the industry. It owns the buildings in which these cooperative restaurants are being established. But just because the state owns it for the people as a whole doesn't mean that they have to run it. Management, control can devolve to those who are in actual control of those means of production. So it's that separation between ownership and management that we're seeing being played out in the formation of cooperatives. Now, another part of the devolving of control is found in the formation of small and medium-sized private businesses. In addition to cooperatives, another important non-state sector of the economy that is growing are the private restaurants and private taxi services, etc. That individuals can own. The paladars are familiar restaurants to anyone who's traveled to Cuba. Paladars were opened in the 90s, where authorization was given for people to have small restaurants in their homes, in which members of the family could work. Now, with the reforms, the paladars no longer have to be small. They can employ wage labor, people who are not members of the family, and have grown considerably in size. Well, many people point to these new private businesses as the beginning of capitalism coming to Cuba. But in effect, these were conceived of not as capitalist enterprises, but as petty bourgeois enterprises, where the owner of the business would be directly involved in running the business, would employ some wage labor, but on a limited scale. So they would be, small petty bourgeois enterprises, which could potentially become capitalist enterprises if they were allowed to grow. But the Cuban policy is to prevent the accumulation of wealth in private hands. And so, though these small businesses are licensed and taxed and regulated by the state, the policy says they will not be allowed to become large and potentially capitalist enterprises. Whether it would be possible to control them in that way or not remains to be seen. As I see it, there is an emerging competition between the cooperative sector and the small business sector. between the two, that they make up the non-state sector of the economy, that is projected to constitute, within the next few years, 40% of employment in Cuba and 45% of the GDP. So we're not talking about a small part of the economy. The question is whether these private businesses are going to be the major part of it, or cooperatives are going to be the major part of it. Cooperatives are seen as a socialist form of collective enterprise. The socialist because they can function as little schools of socialism that people in the course of their daily work life develop the values of cooperation and of responsibility and solidarity, not only among themselves, but with the larger society. Private businesses are not socialist. They are compatible with socialism if they're contained and regulated properly, but they do not educate their members in socialist values. They are schools of individualism. And the danger is that if that sector becomes a major part of the economy, it can corrupt the socialist values and the socialist culture that is needed in order for Cuba to continue to move forward in constructing socialism. Well, that's a very brief overview of the new cooperative movement underway in Cuba. Questions or comments?
Yes, another question. If the state controls the facilities or owns the facilities, and the cooperative would say that, well, I need these modifications to the facilities in order to be successful, who resolves that, and who is responsible for improving the facilities or building or whatever there?
Okay, the cooperative pays a lease fee to the state-owned facility. And if they make improvements in it, then for the first year at least, they pay nothing. They have free use of the facility. So there's the incentive to make improvements. Now the Bicky restaurant that I referred to, it's a pretty sizable building they have. It includes a restaurant, a pastry shop, and a bar. All in a good commercial location. And even though they're less than a year old, they are now remodeling the third floor in order to expand. And I'm not sure what is going to go there, but I would suspect it might be a nightclub or something like that. So the state gives an incentive for improvements in the facility. And those improvements can increase the profitability of the co-op significantly. So there is an incentive to do that. Another example of a restaurant, La Casona de 17, is a co-op restaurant located right across the street from Folksville, which is the tallest building in Nevada. That building, it used to be a fine old mansion, a very elegant building, and was owned by the Ministry of Tourism, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And they've turned that over to a co-op, very successful co-op. It has 3 areas. One area is kind corridor where the restaurant serves daily fare. In the mansion itself, they have rather elegant meeting rooms where they make available for banquets and the like, weddings, those kinds of events. And then up on the second floor, they have a meeting room, equipped with all of the state-of-the-art, DVD projection equipment and sound equipment and so on. During the day, that is rented to groups to have meetings, and in the evening it becomes a disco. So you have several different operations all within a single space, a single facility that is all part of a single cooperative. Yeah.
Well, if you're seeing this as a competition between the privately owned business and co-ops, for the private sector, basically, it seems like the privately owned has a big head start. I mean, it's way ahead, and it's also fed by tourism to a large degree, both of them. So, do you see any signs of the co-op? Well, it's very early, I guess, for figuring out how well it's going to go.
Yeah. The private sector does have a big head start, and the cooperative sector is sort of being held back in its growth. It's very easy to set up, relatively easy to set up a private business. You can get the legal license and other requirements met rather quickly, but for a co-op to get its legal papers can take months or years even. There's also the fact that there is investment money available for the private businesses. If you have relatives in Miami who send remittances, even modest amounts can go a long way in Cuba to establish a business. And in addition, you get supplies, relatives or friends traveling to Cuba will bring supplies that are needed. And many of the supplies are very difficult to obtain within Cuba. A couple of years ago, I visited a private restaurant right near the U.S. intersection, now the U.S. Embassy. Very upscale restaurant, and talked with the manager. Well, it wasn't clear whether he was the manager or the owner or a partner, but he had some kind of a connection with a Mexican company and got most of his supplies from Mexico. So you have very, very strange combinations emerging. This June, when we were there, we found several private restaurants that were kind of, the house it was in was owned by the woman. The money came from a Spaniard who married in. A foreigner cannot own property in Cuba. So if a foreigner wants to set up a business, one way to do it is to marry a Cuban. Bring in the money.
Did you have a question?
No, okay then. And then
I was just curious about the legalization of co-ops. I mean, like, how does that in other parts of the world, in the capitalist world, what does it mean to be a co-op, and how is that different I mean, do you have to be certified as a co-op in the States, or is it a certain legal form?
Well, if you want the cooperative to be able to have, say, a bank account in its name, it has to exist as a legal entity.
Right, but in the States, can't you just
the
be
co-op wants to take
partnership and
take a
run
bank
themselves as a co-op?
take a bank loan or anything, it has to exist as a legal entity. It has to be incorporated as such.
But I think it's
It doesn't make
because, like in the States, like just the same as in Cuba, you can register as a legal entity and then run
as a co-op.
your organization as a co-op, which you also mentioned happens in Cuba because it's so difficult to form a cooperative. There are some private enterprises that are run like co-ops, but are registered as private businesses. And so,
But that means they don't get the benefits of it being a co-op, which is a lower tax rate and preferential access to bank loans.
And that wouldn't exist in the States anyway. Probably, I would
Right,
imagine.
yeah. That's
But
not an
we'll
issue
figure
in
it
the
out.
U.S.
See, I would like to say, Cliff, talking about what you were saying, in my recent trips to Cuba, I found very complicated and in some way sad situation, with people, and I think it's a very important moment that they are having, no? And I think the impact of globalization, as we see in Mexico, in Cuba as a socialist economy, they have a very also big impact what is happening right now. What I see is some people in Cuba that you can imagine how they do the quantity of money they have. For example, I met a rapper. He was a millionaire, and he was living in Cuba. And I talked to him, and he said, yes, because I travel all around, and he lives like a millionaire in Cuba. So the state, how control this talent of this boy, because he was a boy, he was 23 years old, and he was a Ferrari, he had a Ferrari in Havana. So imagine the other kids that see this kind of boy, they want to be like him. It's like the same case like the narcos in Mexico. But in Cuba they want to be rappers or reggaetoneros. So I think it's very interesting, the phenomenon, what is happening with these cases. Other cases is the relatives that se casan, they marry with a Cuban, and these people had a lot of money and start to invest in some business with the wife or the husband. I knew the case of a man from Italy that he married with a girl in a beautiful place near to the beach, and he has a house. They restore the house, they have a mini hotel, they have a restaurant, and it's amazing, They are the rich of the town.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting what is happening. I have to answer the phone.
And a related aspect to that is that there's a racial dimension to this too. The remittance money that is the basis for the formation of a lot of these private businesses come from white relatives in Florida or New Jersey, because most of those who left Cuba to the U.S., especially in the early years, were part of the white elite. Generally, blacker Cubans did not leave. They were the main beneficiaries of the revolution. So they stayed. But that's having a very negative effect now, because a lot of the money coming in remittances goes to whites who employ whites. Paladars that I went to, rarely would you see a very dark Cuban working there, unless maybe in the kitchen washing dishes.
I can't remember the name of the Cuban lady that was at for the tour that we went on 3 years ago at the
The
center.
guide?
Yeah,
Rita.
And she just went really quick over this cooperative period in Cuban agriculture, and she sort of cast a dark shadow over it. What actually happened in this period? And was it farmers marketing their products cooperatively, or was it groups of farmers working together in a cooperative sense, or what?
There are two different main models. Besides the, Cliff mentioned the UBPCs, which were typically the larger state, blocks that were converted into cooperatives. But then, previously for the agriculture, there are two sets: the credit and service cooperatives, which are farmers that hold their own land and join together for credit and services, and the CPAs, the cooperatives of agricultural production. I don't remember the exact translation. And that's where farmers pooled their land together and then made decisions collectively about this land now held in common.
Uh-huh.
And those are the two models. The CCS is the most efficient. There's that link of, having ownership of something and making decisions over something that's yours, and then as well in the collective. That seems to work well in comparison to when we're all in this together, but everyone's but no one's, right? With the CPA, with holding the land collective and doing everything together. So those were the two main models of cooperatives that were used for the small producers.
Uh-huh.
It was a tremendous time, right? What did you call it? What was it? The English translation when the takeover of the small businesses?
Revolutionary offensive.
Right, and that was,
1968.
in terms of small businesses and, similar uncertainty and transitions happening in the agricultural sector. It was a huge experiment on how to organize human beings, right?
Right.
So, a lot of lessons learned, I think, good and bad.
But then we went out to the tobacco patch over in Pilar, or wherever it is, and those people actually held on to their small farms all through the whole thing.
If I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure that they were members of a CCS.
Oh, they were.
So
Okay.
that piece of land, would be held by that family. They make decisions. They would have access to equipment, to inputs through the cooperative, and through that they would also have obligations for to produce a certain amount of tobacco for the cooperative. But that unit is their families.
Uh-huh.
Is that it? Are we going to be off the hot seats?
Other questions or comments?
No, just
No? Well, thank you for coming. And if you're interested in going to Cuba, I've got some brochures. This is about the 2 trips that we did this year. One has already happened. Liz went on it. That was the June trip on cooperatives. But this also has information on the upcoming organic agriculture trip, which you can still join.
This is not the agricultural trip.
Yeah,
It is.
Ah,
Look inside.
See, yeah.
Organic
November.
agriculture and cooperatives.
There are two,
Yeah.
two trips.
Yeah, so if you open it up, you'll see
That was
The two-
one happened in the next.
described. One has already happened, the other is still coming up.
Yes, it's already happened.
oh, we should turn this on.